Jason Greenblatt, thanks for joining us. You're the author of a book called In the Path of Abraham. Given the recent announcement that Saudi Arabia and Iran have now diplomatic relations, that book seems more relevant than ever. What's your sense about this announcement?
Well, thanks for having me. And I agree, it is more relevant than ever because what's happening in the Middle East shows us what happens when the United States doesn't do what it's supposed to do in the Middle East, when it disrespects Saudi Arabia, when it alienates Saudi Arabia and other allies in the region. I have to reluctantly congratulate China for getting this deal done. It is important to Saudi and the GCC generally. And I think we're going to have to watch and see what happens for Israel. But I do think it's not ideal for the United States.
What impact do you see this having in the region?
I think it's if it lasts, meaning if it gets implemented in 2 months from now, and let's remember it's not a peace agreement, but it's a restoration of diplomatic ties. I think it could bring stability to the region. That's particularly important for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as everyone knows, has Vision 2030. Not only is it a breathtaking vision, but they've made remarkable progress actually building it out. I see it every time I go there. And this will allow Saudi Arabia to worry less about mischief and violence perpetrated by Iran. I think it'll keep calm if it holds, and I think that's important.
And what impact does this have for the United States and its influence in the region?
Well, now the United States has another world power that is in the Middle East. That is to our detriment. Again, I think China did a good job doing this. China is important to Saudi Arabia and the region. The region is very important to China. China actually has a lot of leverage over Iran. But the United States essentially has ceded some important ground, an important area for U.S. stability and security to China to some degree. That's not good for the United States. I think the United States ought to pay attention. I don't know if the Biden administration was caught flat-footed. It's hard to tell. But they ought to pay much closer attention now and work with the region, in particular Saudi Arabia, to be a part of it and not pivot away from it.
How does this complicate things for Israel right now? And there has been talk about a military strike against Iran nuclear facilities, especially as they get closer to weapons-grade uranium. What does this portend for Israel?
It's an excellent question, and frankly, I don't know that anyone really knows the answer yet. I think we have to watch it closely. What I don't like seeing is sides sort of saying, the Abraham Accords are over. The Abraham Accords are really not part of this conversation today. I don't think it's negative to the Abraham Accords, but I think we should push the Abraham Accords to the side for a moment as we watch this. The more important question is what you're asking, which is, what does it mean for Israel when it comes to Iran? Iran obviously supports the Houthi terrorists, which affect Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It supports Hezbollah. It supports Hamas. If Iran is willing to keep them quiet, that's a good thing. If Iran pushes them further to make more trouble, in particular Hezbollah and Hamas, that is very, very bad. But I think Israel needs to take a very, very close watch at this. Them too. I don't know if they were caught flat-footed here, but I think that rather than blaming within Israel whose fault this is, I think they need to look forward and figure out how do they protect Israel and how do they further integrate Israel into the security architecture of the Middle East.
Yeah, and you're one of the architects of the Abraham Accords. What do you see the future? Do you see actually still the possibility of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords?
I don't think Saudi Arabia's position on the Abraham Accords has changed. It's funny that on Thursday we heard Saudi demands of the United States for the Abraham Accords to actually be implemented in Saudi Arabia. They were important. There were large demands, but they also made a lot of sense. I don't blame Saudi Arabia for listing those demands. And then the very next day they announced the restoration of diplomatic ties with Iran. So you're having these in the same breath. Those are on the heels of Oman opening its airspace to Israel, and Saudi Arabia airspace remains open. So I think the Abraham Accords shouldn't be part of the conversation at the moment. We should watch and wait and see. Israel is a very powerful, important country in the Middle East, but I don't think Israel figures large into this deal for Saudi Arabia at the moment. It's on the list of things Saudi Arabia has to consider, but the most important thing that Saudi Arabia has to consider is what's best for Saudi Arabia, how do we protect the people and the assets and the legacy of what Saudi Arabia is and is to become. That's the most important part of this conversation, together with understanding China's role here and the U.S.'s lack of role here.
Internally, there seems to be a lot of debate about who's to blame for this, back and forth. How do you see this working out internally here in Israel?
I would encourage every Israeli to ignore the political statements. They're meaningless in the context of what happened. There's going to be a lot of people trying to gain advantage by blaming one side or the other side. Let's push all of that off to the side and watch it, see how it affects Israel, see how it affects Israel's security, hope that it's beneficial to everybody in the region. And in theory, it really could be. And I would ignore the political grandstanding.
Yeah. Your book, In the Path of Abraham, is very optimistic about the future of the Middle East. Are you still optimistic? And what did you conclude from your analysis in your book?
I am still very optimistic. As I mentioned, I travel there a lot, and with each passing trip, I'm just sort of amazed at what's happening on the ground in particular in Saudi Arabia. So I'm very, very optimistic. And I think we can look to the UAE to understand a country that has recognized a way to be close with Israel, develop strong ties with Israel, do significant business, and have security cooperation with Israel, while at the same time being realistic and understanding that Iran is also part of the region, and they can have ties with Iran while at the same time as having ties with Israel. So if everybody plays their cards correctly and fairly, and maybe China will continue to play this role. I wish it was the United States. I hope the United States comes back in, but hopefully China will play a realistic, rational role here, keep things calm, and therefore I, for the moment anyway, am still optimistic about stability.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Jason, about what's happening right now in the Middle East?
Well, Israel is going through some challenging times right now. And I think there, too, there's a lot of politics going around. There's a lot of people trying to gain advantage and manipulate things. I'd like to see Israel in a more stable place. But I still remain bullish for Israel, bullish for the region, even with these unusual, surprising and events that we don't quite understand yet and will unfold day by day to see how they impact the U.S., how they impact Israel, how they impact the United States allies and friends in the Middle East, including the GCC countries.
Right. Jason Greenblatt, author of In the Path of Abraham. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you.